In 1961, the year Adolf Eichmann went on trial in Jerusalem for coordinating the murder of millions of Jews during the Holocaust, a Yale psychologist named Stanley Milgram began an experiment he had been designing for months. Eichmann's defense was that he was following orders, that he was not a monster but an ordinary bureaucrat executing the commands of his superiors. Milgram wanted to test whether that defense had any psychological validity. What he found shook the foundations of how Western civilization understood itself. The experimental setup was deliberately elegant. A participant arrived at Milgram's laboratory and was told they were taking part in a study of memory and learning. They were introduced to another person, ostensibly a fellow participant but actually a trained Confederate. Through a staged drawing, the real participant was always assigned the role of teacher. The Confederate became the learner. The learner was taken to an adjacent room and strapped to a chair with electrodes attached to their arm. The teacher sat before an imposing electrical shock generator, a large machine with 30 toggle switches labeled from 15 volts to 450 volts. The labels escalated: slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, danger, severe shock, and finally, the last two switches, ominously labeled XXX. The machine wasn't real. The shocks weren't real. But the participant didn't know that. The teacher was instructed to ask the learner memory questions. With each wrong answer, they were to administer a shock increasing by 15 volts with every error. The learner, in the adjacent room, responded according to a pre-recorded script. At 75 volts, they began grunting. At 120 volts, they shouted that the shocks were painful. At 150 volts, they demanded to be released from the experiment. At 300 volts, they refused to answer further. Past 330 volts, there was only silence. When teachers hesitated or expressed reluctance, the experimenter, a stern figure in a gray lab coat, delivered one of 4 prods: "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. And finally, you have no other choice, you must go on." The prods did not involve threats. There was no gun, no legal consequence, no direct coercion. Just a man in authority saying, in effect, that the situation required compliance. Before running the experiment, Milgram asked psychiatrists, students, and colleagues to predict how many participants would go all the way to 450 volts. The psychiatrists predicted roughly 1%, only the most pathological personalities, they said, those with aggressive or sadistic tendencies. The students predicted similarly small numbers. The consensus was that most people would refuse early. The conscience, it was assumed, would intervene. 65% of participants administered the maximum 450 volts. In Milgram's original study with 40 male participants, 26 went to the end of the scale. They heard the learner demand to be released. They heard his screams. They heard the silence after 330 volts. And they kept going. Not because they were pathological. Not because they were sadistic. The transcripts show many were visibly distressed, sweating, trembling, asking the experimenter to stop, but they continued to comply. Milgram conducted the experiment in multiple variations that reveal the specific factors driving compliance. When the experiment was moved from Yale University's prestigious campus to a commercial office building in Bridgeport, obedience dropped somewhat but remained at 47%. When the teacher could see the learner through a window, obedience dropped to 40%. When the teacher had to hold the learner's hand onto a shock plate, obedience dropped to 30%. Physical proximity to the victim mattered. But even with direct physical contact, nearly 1 in 3 participants complied fully. The most revealing variation, when 2 experimenters were present and they appeared to disagree with each other about whether to continue, obedience dropped to near 0. When the experimenter left the room and gave instructions by phone, obedience dropped dramatically, and several participants secretly administered lower voltages while reporting they were following the protocol. Authority required presence. The moment the authority figure was absent, the internal ethical compass reasserted itself. The compliance was not genuine conviction, it was situational. What psychological mechanism explains 65% compliance? Milgram proposed the concept of an agentic state, a mental mode in which a person perceives themselves as an agent of an authority rather than an autonomous actor. In this state, moral responsibility shifts upward in the hierarchy. You're not the one hurting anyone. You're executing instructions. The experimenter said to continue. You continued. Responsibility lies with the authority who commanded the action, not the person who performed it. This psychological shift doesn't happen consciously. Participants didn't think, I'll enter agentic state now. The shift is triggered by contextual features that have deep evolutionary roots: deference to authority, especially expert authority, in contexts that signal institutional legitimacy. The lab coat, the prestigious institution, the framing is science, the incremental escalation from small to large shocks, all of these contextual features combine to trigger compliance before conscious evaluation can engage. The incremental nature of the escalation is crucial. No participant was asked, at the start, to administer a potentially lethal shock to a screaming victim. They were asked to administer 15 volts to someone getting a question wrong. Then 30 volts. Then 45. By the time the shocks were severe, the participant had already committed to a behavioral pattern. Stopping would require acknowledging that everything they'd already done was wrong. The psychological cost of stopping increased with every switch they'd already thrown. Milgram's research has been replicated and extended in ways that confirm the core findings hold across time, culture, and demographic groups. A 2009 replication by Jerry Berger at Santa Clara University, halted at 150 volts for ethical reasons, found that compliance rates at that point were statistically indistinguishable from Milgram's original, despite being conducted nearly 50 years later. A 2017 study in Poland found similarly high compliance. The mechanisms are not cultural artifacts. They are human. The implications for understanding historical atrocities are profound and disturbing. Historian Christopher Browning documented the behavior of ordinary middle-aged German policemen in Reserve Police Battalion 101, who participated in the mass murder of Jewish civilians in occupied Poland in 1942. Their commander explicitly told them they could opt out without penalty. The majority participated anyway. Browning's conclusion, informed partly by Milgram, was that situational pressure, peer conformity, authority, and incremental normalization mattered more than ideology in driving compliance. The Nuremberg defense, "I was following orders," has been rejected as a legal defense since the Nuremberg trials. But Milgram's research suggests it may be a psychological reality. The people who committed bureaucratic atrocities during the Holocaust were not primarily sadists or true believers in Nazi ideology. Many were, as Hannah Arendt famously described Eichmann, examples of the banality of evil, ordinary people in administrative roles who complied with monstrous instructions within a framework of institutional authority. One of the most important elements of Milgram's observations was the role of peers in resistance. In variations where two Confederates, playing fellow teachers, refused to continue, the real participants' rate of compliance dropped to just 10%. Social permission to refuse is enormously powerful. One person saying "I won't do this" changes the entire social calculus for everyone around them. Resistance is contagious in exactly the way compliance is. Milgram himself was deeply affected by his findings. In interviews and essays, he returned repeatedly to the question of what the results meant for social organization. He concluded that modern hierarchical societies create the exact conditions for the agentic state to operate at scale: specialized roles, distributed responsibility, expert authority, legitimate institutional framing. Atrocities require no monsters. They require ordinary organizational structures and ordinary people who defer to them. The experiment's ethical status remains contested. Milgram's participants experienced genuine distress that was real, even though the shocks were not. Many were not told the truth until later in the session. Post-experiment interviews and follow-up surveys, however, showed that the large majority reported they were glad they had participated and felt they had learned something important about themselves. A minority reported lasting distress. The ethical calculus is genuinely difficult. What would cause you to refuse? Milgram identified that certain features consistently produced earlier resistance: seeing a peer refuse, having direct visual contact with the victim, having the authority figure physically absent, and explicitly naming the moral responsibility, being told you are hurting this person. That last point is particularly important. When participants' attention was directed explicitly to the human being suffering consequences, compliance dropped. The abstraction of the victim is a mechanism of harm. The Milgram experiments offer something more than a bleak portrait of human compliance. They map the conditions under which resistance becomes possible. The presence of a disobedient peer. The physical proximity to those affected by your actions. The explicit assignment of personal moral responsibility. The absence of escalating commitment. These are not mysterious. They are features that can be incorporated into institutional design and that can be sought out or created by individuals in positions where obedience is expected and harmful. The question Milgram set out to answer, could the Holocaust have happened in America, was answered, not with an unequivocal yes, but with a deeply uncomfortable, the psychological conditions required are not uniquely German or uniquely historical. The mechanisms that enable ordinary people to harm others through institutional compliance are structural, not personal. They're present wherever authority, hierarchy, and incrementalism combine. And they're present right now, in systems you interact with every day. The question is whether you'll recognize them when you're inside them.